So today I'd like to tackle a bit of a touchy, sensitive subject, and that is the modern history of rabbinic attitudes towards women's tznius. That's the fancy academic title. But in more plain-spoken words, we know that many korei has been written in the last last many years, where Rabbanim will come out with a stance on particular articles of clothing, particular modes of dress relating to how frum women dress. And there are obviously mixed opinions, mixed feelings about that. Some people find that oppressive. Obviously, it also depends which community, which Rabbanim, which articles of clothing, or which modes of dress. So there could be a variety and a range where that's concerned. But it is, one could say, it is somewhat a part of our lives. We sort of expect to see such a korei with some regularity, sometimes from Rabbanim from our community, sometimes Rabbanim from some other community. I'm not referring to any specific community when I say our. I'm just representing the person listening, whichever community they're from. So it may be someone from their community, maybe you see a korei from another community that's making the rounds online, perhaps. So the question is, how did we get here, and is there a precedent for this? Where does this come from? And I would like to argue that we may perhaps be marking 100 years around now, last year, this year, about 100 years from the modern tznius korei, from this phenomenon of Rabbanim coming out publicly to sort of condemn popular modes of dress among Jewish women, among frum women, and to to legislate, or either there's obviously levels and degrees to which how detailed they're getting, or what they're condemning, or how they're going about it, or how they're suggesting to implement it. But all under that rubric, all under that umbrella of putting out such statements in a formal, official way, using the methods, the means of sort of putting out a public statement, broadcasting it to the public in this manner, versus writing something in a sefer or something. The argument is that we may be marking 100 years of that. And so I'd like to dig in a bit into this early modern history, not recent memory anymore. You sort of have to go back and dig through the sources. You're unlikely to, it's not something, some parts of history, some details sort of remain in the common memory, in the common perception of history. And some things you sort of have to go back and dig to uncover that, to rediscover what happened, when it happened, and how we got from there to here. So in this case, I would like to start with a news item that I found. I have one of my hobbies is, among other things, I like to search Jewish history from 100 years ago today, or 100 years ago this week. So I happened to do that this week again, and sometimes I search the Yiddish press, sometimes I search the English language press. So you have a website, newspapers.com, which allows you to search a tremendous range of English language press, American newspapers. And if you have access, which someone has, I'm grateful that someone has given me access to their account, because it is somewhat of an expensive product to pay for. If you search the word Jewish or the word rabbi, and you limit it to a particular day or a particular range of days, the days corresponding to this week, you could see what any old random American newspaper in Kentucky perhaps may have been reporting about the Jews. Sometimes they were reporting on something local. Obviously, there were many Jewish communities and rabbis spread throughout the United States, more perhaps than we even imagine today. But also back then, you had the JTA. The JTA is still technically around. Back then, the JTA was, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, was a wire service that had journalists perhaps around the world, certainly in large Jewish areas with large Jewish concentrations. And they were a news service, just like today you have the Associated Press, the AP, or Reuters. Those are sort of the two big ones. So back then, maybe there's also UPI. It's not relevant to our discussion directly. So back then, you had the JTA, and the JTA genuinely every day. You can go actually to the JTA's website. You can see their archives directly there, although sometimes it's not as easy to search directly. But they do have their archives, and you can sort of see their daily bulletin. They would release a bulletin every day with, I don't know, maybe 5-6 pages. Each page had a number of news items of varying lengths, and they would send this out to the world, to whichever newspapers were subscribing to their wire service, presumably. And newspapers, even random local newspapers in random American locales, were often looking for interesting news from around the world, from other places, other communities that had its own chen to it, that people enjoyed seeing stuff like that. So sometimes you'll see reports about what the Jews are up to in Poland in some random American newspaper, and that's the reason. So in this case, I don't have the name of the paper in front of me. Maybe it's called the Lexington Herald. I think it's Lexington, Kentucky. But it doesn't really matter because, like I said, it's in all likelihood coming from the JTA. So the following headline appeared in an American newspaper 100 years ago this week. And as you'll see, the headline seems to be having a bit of fun with it. But the headline was, "Feminine Attire Arouses Polish Rabbis." And that sounds like it's intended to be a bit of a play on words, where obviously there's the more negative in a tznius context connotation of arouses, but back then, perhaps more, the word arousal, I guess, would also be used to refer to the fact that people got agitated or up in arms, upset about something. So, but I'm assuming that the play on words was intended. At any rate, and here's maybe the place to mention that, although we'll obviously keep this as edel and as clean as possible, but we are going to be speaking about tznius and women's dress, so it's unavoidable that there'll be some description or reference to particular modes of dress. So just worth to mention that up front. Like I said, obviously we'll keep it relatively edel, but that's the nature of the subject. And here the article reads, Warsaw, June 14th. Jewish rabbis of Poland are aroused over the quote-unquote immoral modes of Jewish women who are allowing themselves to be, quote, misled by the dictatorship of Paris and bowed down to it like slaves, etc., etc. And they write, so declares a manifesto issued by the Polish Rabbinate to the Jewish population of Poland. And there's another paragraph quoting another paragraph from the manifesto. And just a short item, you see the full page, they just had a bunch of different random items on that page, and they threw this in. Maybe they got a longer item and they shortened it just to fit the gap on the page that they wanted to fill. But this is what was being reported around the world in, like I said, pretty much a random newspaper about what the rabbis of Poland are up to. So this item keeps it pretty short, doesn't give us a lot of information. However, the same search turned up what appears to be likely the full article. The full article was printed at the time, same week, in the Australian Jewish News, I believe is the name of the newspaper. Again, don't have it in front of me. But this was a Jewish newspaper in Australia. It goes back pretty far. I don't remember. I believe it goes maybe even back to the mid-1800s. It's definitely an old Jewish newspaper, as far as I can recall. But this is, like I said, this week, 100 years ago, 1925, June. So the article there, and I'll read this more or less in full. The article reads, The Dress of the Modern Woman, the Polish Rabbis Manifesto. I guess that's, if you want to use a term for korei, so usually in the from Hamish milieu, we just say korei, but I guess if you wanted to translate into English, I guess manifesto would be the most approximate term to use. But surely it just means a korei. And here they write explicitly, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency has received from Warsaw the text of an important manifesto on the subject of women's dress, which has been issued by the Polish Rabbinate to the Jewish population of Poland. And what follows are 5 paragraphs, some longer, some shorter, which seems to be pretty much a direct translation of the original korei. And I think I'll just go ahead and read it. The Jewish people is disturbed. Every upright heart is filled with pain because of the latest ugly modes which have invaded our Jewish homes. Now, the use of the word mode here is interesting because the source, the original, surely was using the word mode. Now, mode in Yiddish is used to refer to fashion. So technically, the more accurate translation, I think, here would have been the ugly fashions which have invaded our Jewish homes. But it's interesting when you have shared words between languages and mode may be synonymous, or at least a cognate of the word mode in English. I didn't go actually check it up, but whoever translated it translated mode as mode. So just keep in mind that when it says mode, it's what we would call fashion. Our daughters, who always distinguish themselves by their modesty and their moral behavior, are allowing themselves to be misled by the quote-unquote dictatorship of Paris and bow down to it like slaves, wearing immoral dresses which have the purpose only of exciting lust. With regret, we see that this sinister mode, fashion, is spreading further every day and breaking up the barrier which has for thousands of years separated us from immoral peoples and retained in our people the best and the holiest and most pure. Woe to the generation which has lived to see this. Woe to the eyes which look upon it. We, the rabbis of the whole of Poland assembled, as the responsible leaders of the Jewish people, appeal to you, Jewish daughters, women and girls, with tears of blood in our eyes. Recall the dark days of the Great War, by which we mean World War I. Recall the sufferings and the miseries through which the Jewish people have passed, the number of Jewish daughters who were outraged, which is a euphemism for being the victim of assault in the context of assaulting women. Today, when God in His mercy has come to our aid so that we can breathe freely, you, by your disgraceful fashions, are trying, God forbid, to bring new troubles upon our people. How can you take this grave responsibility upon yourselves? What will you answer to God? Blessed be His name, Kadosh Baruch Hu. Every upright person with any ethical feeling regards with disgust and with revulsion your present-day clothing. The best of the Gentiles look upon you with scorn. To us Jews, it is one of the greatest of sins, and according to the holy Jewish law, a married woman wearing this immodest dress may be divorced. In order to do away with this disgraceful mode in Jewish houses, we, the assembled rabbis of Poland, have found it necessary to issue this appeal to all our brothers and sisters in the whole of Poland, that they should form special committees in all their towns, the object of which should be to consider how, with all the means at their command, to wash off this shame from our people and to restore Jewish spotlessness and pride. We remind you that, according to Jewish law, every husband and father who tolerates this immodesty in his home ought to be expelled from every Jewish institution. No Jewish man may enter a place in which there are women or girls wearing these disgraceful clothes. The tailors and dressmakers who make such dresses bear the responsibility of their sin. We hope that our Jewish daughters, who have shown such readiness to sacrifice themselves for the Jewish people, will this time too bow to our passionate appeal and will see the justice of our earnest exhortation. That's the end of the article and the end of the manifesto, the korei. Obviously, we can't assume that every single word and phrase is translated accurately, or that there isn't any, they weren't bekatzer anywhere. But it certainly rings like you can sort of picture the original, which I'll get to in a moment, whether it was Yiddish or Hebrew. I would assume it's Hebrew, but I'll get to that in a moment. So you can sort of, it definitely has the ring of a rabbinic korei. Obviously, though, this korei does sort of read as particularly harsh. They mention about that a man is mechuyev to divorce their wives if they dress this way. Husbands and fathers who tolerate it should be expelled from every Jewish institution, etc. So this is pretty harsh language. So part of the question would be, what type of dress are we even referring to? Especially in the second half, it keeps on referring to this dress, these dresses, such dresses. What are we actually referring to? So here's where I came across, after having come across these two rather easily. They sort of just popped up when I searched for Jewish or rabbi from 100 years ago. But I went and tried to find and see, can I find the original Hebrew text? So to date, I have not found an original Hebrew text. It's possible that it was printed in the newspaper and I didn't find it. It's possible that it wasn't printed in the newspaper and hasn't been preserved in any particular sefer, so it would require a lot of extra digging to track it down. It's also possible that the following article, which is in Yiddish and appears to have the exact same text but in Yiddish, perhaps the Yiddish is the original. And we'll get to what the context was at the time and what the rabbis, the rabbinate of Poland, was up to at the time. But there's an article in, I believe it's the Tug of Varsha, one of the Yiddish papers in Varsha. We know Varsha was a hotbed for Jewish and Yiddish culture, much of it not so religious at the time. And here the article is actually a rather long article, and it actually focuses on two themes. They say the rabbis are going after both the outbreak, the rash of suicide, and women's fashions. Now, I don't have the first half of the article in front of me. I only cut out the second half. But even the second half is still sort of concluding and alluding to the suicide phenomena, which is also interesting. I guess probably should have given a trigger warning for that as well. I don't know if YouTube loves hearing that word anyway. But we'll say ma'abed atzmai ladas, or in Yiddish it's Selbstmord. But it seems like there was some kind of outbreak and rash of this at the time, which is interesting and unfortunate in an unfortunate way, because there has been some talk lately about the frum world, the Chassidish world even, dealing with some kind of problem like this in the last few months. So it's interesting to see that there was an outbreak of this at the time. And the article, the person writing, sounds a bit more like an opinionated piece. Somewhere it's a sort of a blend, somewhere between news reporting and opinion. Seems to be blaming it on the financial situation at the time. It says many families are financially ruined, but sort of blaming the women. And the author of the article himself is implying that we can find the commonality between the two themes of blaming women, although I don't think the rabbis were blaming the women overtly in the case of the Selbstmord, but the author is suggesting that one may be inclined to blame the women for spending where the husband can't afford it, etc., etc. Obviously, we don't have to take these words as coming from Sinai, but interesting analysis of the situation and how people were living a lifestyle at the time that they couldn't afford, which also seems sort of to resonate with today's day and age. So it's always interesting to see patterns that we think may be unique to our society today that may actually be repeating themselves from a previous era. But then the article comes along and says that the korei of the Rabbanim are being oisig zum sich vernommen mit noch an inyan. What is that? Mit dekoltierte Freuen. So this actually reveals what precisely the Rabbanim were being moicha. What are the dresses, such dresses? What are we talking about? We're talking about dekoltierte Freuen, and they repeat the word, I think, somewhere further in the article as well. Now, what does dekoltierte mean? So that's it's a particular word that you'll probably, I think, only appears in Yiddish more or less from around that decade, and it's equivalent to a term that in English, although even in English it's not really English, it's French. But in English, there's a word décolletage or something like that. And we'll say it edel, but that essentially refers to a woman's dress where the neckline plunges so much that it is very revealing. Now, we're not just talking about the collarbone, but much further along. That, first of all, immediately sort of gives us a bit more context as to what the Rabbanim are reacting to, and we'll elaborate a bit more on that in our discussion. But that's the key word that's missing from the English reports. The English reports just said the rabbis are upset about clothing, but the Yiddish is referring to the fact that it's referring to dekoltierte Freuen. It was pretty obvious in the context at the time. And as we'll see, this word appears in other rabbinic Chassidish sources from that era. And then the article essentially quotes the exact same text, but in Yiddish. Maybe there are some minor. You can use the Yiddish to analyze what the English is saying, but of course the word used throughout is mode, and the word Pariser Diktatur, and the word here they use a lot for pritzes is oiskalasene, which is still a word that's used in the Chassidish Yiddish today, I believe. But yeah, I don't think there are any major significant differences in the text, but it's good to have both versions of the text side by side to compare. One difference I noticed, I guess, is actually that in the English, when I mentioned about the get, I think the lashon in the English was, according to the Holy Jewish law, a married woman wearing this immodest dress may be divorced, but in the Yiddish, it actually says, al pi din Torah Kedoshah is men mechuyev af a heiratete Frau welche geht also ausgelassen gekleidet zu gatten. So it actually says mechuyev, which obviously is referring to the din of das Moshe Yisrael, which we touched on briefly last week with the Chassam Sofer and the hair covering, alluding to that. And then the article concludes, much like, I guess you could say, bloggers and others today may also comment. The article concludes that in the writer's opinion, the bloody tears, the blutige Tränen, are not likely to help, and the hässliche Mode, the hateful fashion, or whatever the exact English translation of that term was, with the schändliche Kleidung, will probably continue, and koidem kol in the Chassidische Heiser, and most of all, first and foremost, in the Chassidische homes. So this is referring to, and we'll get to this, of what was going on in Poland at the time, and who are we talking about, who was being affected. So we're going to assemble the facts as we go along. And that's pretty much where the article ends. It ends essentially on that note. It's quoting the entire korei in Yiddish, but it's not doing so in an approving fashion, but sort of, here's what the Rabbanim are up to, here's what's bothering them, here's how they're reacting to it, whatever. So like I said, I sort of still think that I would assume there's a Hebrew original, which I haven't been able to find. Obviously, I have my search skills, but sometimes they come up short, or sometimes you don't think of the right place to search or the right way to search. Maybe some of my fellow search aficionados might turn something up. Also, sometimes things were released sort of, often a kol korei is actually released as a sign, as a poster. All the kol koreis that have gone up in Jewish neighborhoods in the last bunch of years, can you find them in the newspaper? Can you find them in the Sfarim? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you need to keep a copy of the paper that went up on the wall. So that could also be the case. There are collections of Jewish papers, posters, and perhaps that will be another place to look. Interestingly, around the same time, I think in relation to this, I was searching earlier this week. I saw that the same, I believe, rabbinic organization had released a kuntres take in Yiddish, which you can find on the National Library of Israel's website, I believe. They released a whole kuntres about the importance of keeping Taras HaMishpacha, simply arguing that it's important to keep it and observe it, which also gives us sort of an inkling into what was going on in Poland at the time. So they were releasing some materials in Yiddish, so it's not completely unthinkable that the kol korei was in Yiddish, but I still suspect there may be a Hebrew text somewhere. Now, while this particular kol korei was news to me, I hadn't come across this particular one before, the tone and the content and the focus on this particular mode of dress was not new to me, because, as I just mentioned, there are other signs and pamphlets and stuff that was released at the time and appears in collections. And a few years ago, I believe it was the Rebbe's library, the Chabad library here in Crown Heights, that they've been scanning different collections within their library. At one point, they posted a collection of posters, of papers, of such artifacts and documents, not necessarily related to Chabad, just stuff that the library happened to collect and keeps in their collection. And someone I know was going through the collection to see what there may be there, what may be interesting. And at one point, he posted a page that was supposed to, it said it's the drasha of the Belzer Rebbe. We're talking about the Bisacher Ber of Belz. The father, I believe, of his successor was Rabbi Aaron of Belz, who survived the war famously, but this is still his father, Bisacher Ber. So this is a standalone page that has a drasha of Rabbi Bisacher Ber of Belz in Yiddish, and the person sharing it noticed that the text kept on referring to dekoltiert freuen, and he asked at the time, what does this word mean? And that's when this word and sort of the reaction, the rabbinic and Hasidic reaction to this word, to this fashion at the time, sort of came on my radar. So at the time, I immediately, I think, recognized what the word meant. It's a word that's in the vocabulary today, to whatever extent. And so I once I came across this kol korei now, I went and revisited that drasha. So that drasha does actually appear in a number of Sfarim. There are different Sfarim on tznius that still reproduce that drasha, so you don't have to dafka find that old page. But it was interesting to see the original page. So one sefer that has it, there's a sefer called Ganois or Ginois Ali Nohar by Muftali Hertzka Reisman. It's a fairly recent sefer on Anyani Tara. I think it's more about the Chasnida, Taras HaMishpacha. It's in Oitzer HaChachma. But in the sefer, there also are some drashas of the Bells Rebbe, of this Bisach Ber of Bells. So there's a drasha from Tafresh Samach Aleph, 1901, which is much earlier, and that's about Shaitlach. And in this drasha, the Bells Rebbe is saying that Shaitlach are not okay, they're not kosher, and I think we touched on that briefly last week, on how up until a pretty late point, Stam, Polish Yidden and people of that region was not the mode, it was not the, here Taka, the word mode is appropriate, it was not the Jewish mode for women to cover their head with a sheitel, and that was considered a pirza at the time, and certainly in the Chassidische Welt, they were a lot more upset about it. So that's one drasha he reproduces here, which is interesting. But he also reproduces this hachraza of the Belz Rebbe. He doesn't give a date here, but after we finish this, I'll share the date. So this is Korei Hashem Chaytzel Avis Eish of Ishalikim B'Sachar Doiv Belz, which he he instructed that they announce this, they make this announcement. I don't know if he himself said it or he dictated it and had them announce it. B'Shmoya Kodesh. Now I'm not going to read the whole thing in Yiddish, especially since some of the Yiddish is maybe not my style of Yiddish, or to read it correctly, the Havara wouldn't be my Havara. But it begins and says, and this Sefer actually has a Hebrew translation as well. So for those who wouldn't feel comfortable with that Yiddish, it does include a Hebrew translation as well. He starts off and he says, All Yidden zanen Baruch Hashem Erlich. So it starts off positive. All Yidden are good. Not coming to say the Yidden are bad, that's not the point. All Yidden zanen Erlich. But after the tzerudete Zeiten, interesting use of tzerudit, but after the tzerudete Zeiten, you can translate it different ways, the stormy times, or even more than that. The tzerudit often is used to mean that someone's a little not so normal. So certainly the abnormal times, but technically it means something. I'd have to think about the technical translation. Doesn't matter. But after the tzerudete Zeiten, that we had nicht heint gedacht, which is a nice Yiddish phrase that it shouldn't happen now. Hashem yishmerenu. So a number of things became okay for women because they don't know the severity of the Isser. And therefore we find women, Nashim as gain in Eigne Haar, Oich in Gilui Basar. We find women going in their own hair, their hair not covered, and as well with Gilui Basar, and in Yiddish, in parentheses, it says, Memeint dekoltiert. We mean dekoltiert and, seemingly, and kurze arbel, short sleeves, and by short sleeves, they presumably mean very short, perhaps close to sleeveless, and there are other sources from that time that maybe we'll get to that seem to suggest that that's what they meant. They didn't mean, although, as I also want to get to, I think previously, likely the default old levush was till the wrist, not till the elbow, but at this point, things had gone so much in the opposite direction that they probably mean up close to the shoulder. So this is how women are dressing, carrying themselves about. Al-Kain is that you should know that in a home where a woman is uncovering her hair, or even an unmarried woman is going begili basar dekoltiert, not to make a bracha, no davar shebekadusha, kiddush, other brachas. It has a din of tinuf and erva. And if even among women themselves, not just when a man is in the presence of a woman, but even if a woman's in shil or in the haim, and there is an isha next to her in the Eigne Haar, or the begili basar dekoltiert, so then even the other woman can't be masker in the tefillah any davar shebekadusha. We're not getting into the halacha, the halachic side of this, but the premise here is that it's erva, and it has a din that you don't say davar shebekadusha in front of the erva. Also al pidin, isha, the isha, abol in Yiddish, bechlal, more Hebrew words were actually in use regularly. So regularly here it's using the word isha instead of froi or vibe or something like that. The isha who does not heed her man or husband to arumtzenam in the har, which is if that's the correct nusach is an interesting term, arumtzenamen. We'll see later though that he says arapnem in the har, which we'll get to. Arumtzenam in the har, to gather the hair, to cover the hair, oder nicht zu gehen, begili basar dekoltiert, kimtir, and get on aksuba. So repeating that point, that in that case, the alpidin, that's Moshe Yisrael, so she gets a get without aksuba. Then he mentions that by tzvila as well, So here he gets basically to the point about shaving the head. He's already alluding to this, that part of the issue of uncovering the, technically when it says earlier, gait in eigen har, technically, since later he talks about shaving, you could say that maybe he meant even if she grows her hair out, but it's covered. But they wouldn't, then the davar shebekdusha wouldn't seem to stem. So it's going from one extreme to the other. Instead of shaving it, they're going in the eigen har and it's exposed. But he's now swinging back to the previous extreme, which is that they should be shaving it. And therefore, even by tefillah, Yishivas gait in the har, it's shiver for the tefillah to be kosher. The hair sticks out. It's not a tefillah. It's very hard to be careful, which I may have mentioned recently was a concern in Russia during the Gzeres Malbushim. So here he's raising that concern. And Gam is all wissen that an Isha is gait in the har of the Bikili Basar. It's a greaser cheshash al pidin oich de kiddushin. The whole kiddushin, the whole marriage is a shayla, is problematic. What's taka pshat? That it's a cheshash in the kedusha. So in this sefer, in this edition, he actually has a footnote, and he brings from a sefer, a late sefer, I think. We have to figure out the exact date of which century this quote is from. But there's a mahalach in the relatively late achronim that when you say by the kedushin, kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, that Kedas Moshe Yisrael isn't referring only to the fact that this is a Jewish marriage, but rather Kedas Moshe Yisrael is referring to the fact that I'm marrying you, that you should behave, you should conduct yourself Kedas Moshe Yisrael, you should follow Das Moshe, you should follow Das Yehudis. So when you say it's implicit, it's included, it's almost like a Tanai in the Kedushin that you can't be over in Das Moshe Yisrael. That's the taich, very interesting taich. So the Belzer Rebbe seems to be alluding to that. He says in the footnote that that's why he's saying it's a chashash al pidin in the kedushin, because the kedushin was al tanai. Every kedushin is al tanai of keeping das Moshe Yisrael, and so if you're being over in das Moshe Yisrael, it's a shayla in the kedushin. Very, very interesting. So he threw that in. And he says also you should know Bechlal Gili Basar, exposing what should be covered by Isha is Bechlal Gili Arayis Rahman al-Islam, which you have to be Meiser Nefesh. The Harg Vayaver, he's saying, goes on even dressing not tznius. Again, we're not evaluating the halachic claims here, but that's what he said. Al Kain, Al Manslight, and Al Vaber are mechuyev to give cover to Hashem Yisparach and the Torah Kedosha. And the women should remove their hair completely. Chas v'shalom shouldn't remain single hair, and no Yiddish tochter should go chalila v'chas begili baser dekoltiert, and the elterin should be mishtalim mesiras nefesh to die zachen sepoilen to bring this about. So Hashem should help. So this was an official announcement made by the Belzer Rebbe that they should announce in the Beis Knesset and Beis Medrash. Somewhere after, in this sefer, just says sometime after World War I, and also on the, I believe on the copy that the Chabad library preserved. I don't think there's a date there either. But interestingly, we have a way of determining the date because Belz today has a publication called Orat Safon, and it's included in Eitzer HaChachma, and they print all kinds of interesting documents and texts of Belz history. And there's interesting stuff there. So in Orat Safon, issue number 72, didn't check the year that it was printed. Could be 10 years ago or whatever. There's a letter, they reproduced the text of a letter written by the Bishia Dom of Razvadov to his friend Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Bigeleisen in New York. You may have heard of the name Bigeleisen from New York. So this is the father of the Mishpacha, the Svarim store, or Taka Belz Chassidim, and he came here, but he remained in touch with Belz and Daheim. So his friend was writing to him a report. And when did he write the report to him? Here there's a date. It doesn't say a date in the letter either. It says Hey Kairach, but they have a cheshbon. It has to be Tafresh Pei Dalet. It has to be Shchedesh Tammuz Tafresh Pei Dalet. So in the summer of 1924. And this is, so it begins with other facts, details, updates, the latest of whatever's going on in Belz. I didn't read it or reread it right now. But then he writes, So it refers to the fact that the second Shabbos that the Belzer Rebbe came back to Belz. So in the footnote, they say that it's the second Shabbos after the Belzer Rebbe returned from Holishitz to Belz, and we know that he returned from Holishitz Yom Gimel Parshas Boy Beis Shvat, so the Hachraza must have been Shabbos Shira Tafresh Pei Daled. And this is like, it sounds like it's Ersht returning. I didn't check the Belzer Rebbe's biography and the chronology timeline, but it sounds like maybe Pashat returning after World War One. Even though World War One had ended a few years earlier, but the Jewish population of Poland had been severely displaced whenever their city and town became the front, and the front moved around a lot dramatically. Obviously, today with the news in Ukraine, it's easier to envision, to picture the matzav. So they write in the footnote that they want to give some background, some context. Say after it ended and all the refugees returned home, they discovered that the war caused not just the terrible harm, beguf, but also benefesh, and the tznius, and all the cities in Galicia plummeted. And suddenly there was a need to be mo'eder and be mazir, to warn about things that before the Milchama were self-understood. So, for example, we're talking about kisui v'giluach sayras harosh l'noshim, and they write they don't hold back. They say from the style and the sharf guide we could tell how widespread, how rampant the situation was. And so he says, so back to the letter, he says this is something that the Adam Shlita announced the second Shabbos he came back, but it gives a disclaimer not to show it to other people. Okay, and then he quotes. He basically copied and pasted the Lashonis. I noticed that in Belz and the Kovetz, they seem to leave out one line. They left out the line about Tvila, and I suspect they left it out because today it's kaviyachol not able to print in the Kovetz Aratzafon a prat about women going to Tvila, which is its own interesting issue about censorship and what we consider appropriate and inappropriate, and what the Torah considered appropriate, or what people considered appropriate in the past versus today. So I remember noticing this a few years ago when I was looking into this Bell's announcement. I noticed that they skipped the whole paragraph, but they left in the Gili Basa Dekoltirt, probably because I'm guessing they don't know exactly what it means. I think even in the Sefer I quoted before that has a Hebrew translation, they write Savar Chasuf, uncovered neck, which, I mean, I guess technically it's about the neckline, but that's not quite the connotation and the implication of the term. But I'm guessing that maybe they don't know or don't realize, or don't think the readers realize what the word means. So that they left in, but the tefillah they left out. But so that's another contemporary source for this announcement of Belzer Rebbe that this chassid sent to his friend Rabbi Yaakov Bigeleisen here in New York. Taka, if you look at the first half of the letter, which I didn't pay so much attention to, Taka, the whole context there is about how the Belzer Rebbe came back, and we're going to restore everything to the way it was before the Milchama. And they write that the Belzer Rebbe escaped from Belz already in 1914, right at the beginning of World War I, and he escaped, wasn't even in Galicia. And then when he returned to Galicia in 1922, Belz was destroyed, so he couldn't return there, so he was for 2 years in Holishitz, until they came back to Belz, Taka, around this time, Shvat, Tafresh Pedal, 1924, beginning of 1924. So that's the whole context here, that, he just came back, and now the Beis Knesset, the Beis Medrash, and the Rebbe's home is up, and the Yoshvim, the Bachrim, they're going to come, they're going to sit and learn, Kabisham Kadmonius. The only difference is that the Rebbe aged a lot. The Belzer Rebbe aged a lot. It's like a 10-year gap, a 10-year jump in life in Belz, which surely was pretty traumatic for everybody at the time. And so there are more details. So that's just the clear, immediate context there about what's going on in Belz. Anyway, so this also just gives us some larger context about what's going on. First of all, the fact that, the Belzer Rebbe is getting up in Belz and talking about women have to cover their hair. And, he's saying they should also shave their hair, but they should not to go begili seir, begili sinus, not to go dekoltirt. It is sort of shocking to imagine today, if the Belzer Rebbe had to get up today and say that. We're not working with that. We're not, the korei we're familiar with are lefiyarech, talking about asach edela, much less overt things like that. So that is certainly some important context here that explains the tone, the tenor of these statements, both of the Rabbanim, organization was the Agudas Rabbanim of Poland, as well as the Belzer Rebbe. And as they write in the Kovitz, there was the spiritual state of the Jewish community in Poland was severely harmed by the events of World War I and the escaping and the returning, and it seems like Jewish institutions and the threads holding Jewish society together just completely frayed and collapsed. People talk about the Alta Zeiten in their time, so it's not just World War II and the Holocaust, but World War I was also a very major event in the history of Jews in these parts. Obviously, each land had its own trends and things that were happening, things that were already in place even before World War I. But for the Belzer Rebbe and for other Rabbanim, they by the time 1924, 1925 rolled around, it was very clear to them that things are dramatically different than they were before, and they are faced with entire new challenges that they couldn't have imagined previously. Now, I want to elaborate a bit more on my thoughts about the context, but I just want to go through a few more, or one or two more sources that I have. Another source that's relevant to this is a publication called Kovitz Drushim that was printed by Agudas Rabbanim of Poland, which is this rabbinic institution that released the korei that we began with. So there's a Kovitz Drushim. It's certainly more than 100 pages long. I don't have the full page number in front of me, but the Kovitz Drushim is a collection of sort of submissions of the Rabbanim, drashas that the Rabbanim that are part of the Agudas Rabbanim of Poland held in their community, and they're sharing it. Maybe others could also use the material. So the Kovitz Drushim that was printed, I think this is the fourth issue, that was printed in Tafresh Pehei 1925, or the end of 1924. So they sort of grouped the drashas, the submissions by theme. So the second section is called Kuntris Chazoin Nifratz, and it's presumably alluding to the fact that it's about pritzes. And it says in the table of contents, Drushim al Dvar, pritzes hamalbushim, v'harisas chukei tznius, shenidrishu b'shabas chazoin, tafresh pedalad, and it has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 17, 18 drashas of 18 different rabbanim, across Poland, Slonim, Brezin, Yanev, just picking some names that may be somewhat familiar, Lenchna. And clearly they all darshan the Shabbos Chazoin, so it seems like it was coordinated. Surely if one searches the newspapers and other sources, one would find even more information if an article hasn't already been written, and there may be an article that I haven't seen in a while that may exist. I'm not sure. But whether or not, certainly one could make an article in Hebrew and Yiddish as well, going through all the sources, including all the sources that can now be accessed more easily from newspapers. So it seems like this was a coordinated thing, and that's why it's called Chazoin Nifratz, because they spoke in Shabbos Chazoin about the pritzes. So I'm just going to, obviously it's many pages, and I'm just going to sample the beginning of the first one. Siman Vav is from the Rav of Lakach. And he begins, and you see it's the mamish the same l'shayin as it's terrible. The partzu geder tznius, and he starts elaborating that they're wearing begadim, lilbish me'ilim chasrei bati yadayim. They're wearing clothing without sleeves. So, like I said earlier, when they say kurtza arbel, I think they mean like almost sleeveless or close to that. Uprimas beis hatzavar, by ripping open. Maybe it's even alluding to the lashon by the saita, where that's done deliberately to shame her. Ripping open the neck. Beperetz meruba ad asher es she'era hera, alluding to the fact that a woman is truly properly exposing parts of the body that are considered private parts. Noisef al asher telachna hanasua is pruis reish begili seir beisha erva. And if you go begili seir in the shuk, then it's mamash in Isser Torah, right? Das Moshe versus Das Yehudis. Lefanim zeis v'Yisrael, mal woman would yitzis b'leik suba. And now, but when it's in a rabim nifratz v'nasek heter mamish erlonish shekach also b'yameinu. And v'lei dai b'zeh. But their mamash partzu yoser begeder erva, essentially adding that there's even more pritzes, more parts of the body being uncovered that would be also even bechadri chadarim and kol shekei, and that Abbas Yisrael should go out to the shuk. And they're describing levush. The letters are a bit erased here, but it says choyrin maisereshas. So maybe there was clothing that was sheer and netting, where still a lot more of the body is exposed, even the parts that are supposedly covered. And it says koimrei umas ha'olam, even the goyish galachim are warning their bnei emunasam, the people of their faith, and they're telling them, al tilmadu me'hayehudim aprum l'shimtza, don't learn from the Jews who are so immodest, and from neshem ubnesem aprutzos. So this is what we're up to, and so this is how he begins his drasha, also very upfront, very explicit about the tznius at the time. And he goes on and continues in this vein, but we can't, even though it's all very interesting, but that's just to give you the sense of what he was talking about, what they were talking about, and this was a big deal. So when we're talking about pritzos, we're not talking about, like I said, not talking about subtle stuff. We're talking about what today would be considered completely irreligious garb. So what's the larger context here? These are my thoughts about the larger context. Often the tznius question, the preoccupation with tznius, is often argued to be a modern phenomenon, and there are those who express it sort of as a criticism that, up until the modern era, rabbis weren't preoccupied with women's dress, and they weren't legislating, and now it seems like rabbis are micromanaging and legislating and sort of mixing in, as we said. I don't know if that's proper English or Yinglish, but they're intervening and mixing their way into the minutiae, the details of women's dress. So it's expressed like that sometimes. So there may be some truth to that, but let's consider the context. Obviously, we know historically, if we zoom out all the way to the time of Tanakh, we know there are the famous psukim in Yeshaya, I believe, about how the women dressed very untzniistic, and it seems to suggest that on a level that would rival the pritzos that one might see today. This Baal Darshan himself quotes those parts of those psukim. Holech v'tofef telachna v'raglein ta'achasna. Famous psukim, famous Gemara describing the details of the pritzos. So the concept existed in antiquity, of course, as well. There's also a famous passage of Reb Chaim Vital in his Sefer HaChazyonos, where he's quoting a dibuk. It's giving Musar in Damascus, and the dibuk describes how the women in Damascus were dressing, and it also sounds pretty pritzistic. And Damascus, at the time, apparently was a very cultured place, and that itself is some interesting context to the life of Reb Chaim Vital and Rabbi Shimon Ajara and the environment they were living in. So it's not like women for all of history and eternity were always completely dressed modestly. Not going to say that. But on the other hand, it does seem safe to say that there was a certain standard and default that women in most places for most of the time were mostly covered. Certainly it seems that was a default in the European lands where Jews lived. And speaking for more the Pashut folk, meaning you talk about the noblemen, the nobility, and they perhaps behave by other standards, and perhaps the women in their lives were more pritzistic, even going further back. But and that's probably the origin. We speak about fashion. Presumably, the further one goes back, fashion was probably in its most proper sense was probably restricted to a very small circle of well-to-do people. But so that might go back further. But for the average person, it seems like they were dressed pretty modestly. Certainly in most of the Muslim world, Arab world as well, one would assume. And again, maybe the Sultan's court was different. But talking about the average Pashut person, it would seem that was more or less the default. So it is true to a certain extent that you don't, certainly in Sifrei Halacha, if you're going to ask where in Shulchan Aruch, let's talk about the measurements of tznius, what has to be covered for women. It's, as far as I know, and it's come up before, there is no such discussion. Often the closest one can get is in the beginning, Siman Gimel, in the beginning of Orach Chaim, and the whereabouts about Mekaymis HaMechusim, more in the context of touching Mekaymis HaMechusim. So that's used to, so from there we can extrapolate what the Gedrei tznius are. I've said it before, it's a bit of a controversial thing to say, especially out of context, but today, often when it comes to women's dress, often the golden rule is that what has to be covered. For the neck, the shear is the collarbone, and for the arms, the shear is the elbow, and for the legs, the shear is the knee. So I've said before that this collarbone, elbow, knee thing is really doesn't have a mucker. You're not gonna. There's no mucker for it before the last 50 years or so. Or I mean, I guess it would be a question of what the first source is, but it's pretty recent. So again, that could be taken two ways. Does that mean that once upon a time people weren't makbid to cover these areas? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it doesn't seem like there was a formal discussion about it, presumably because it was more or less never pashut for most people, most times and most places. And in fact, as I've spoken about before, there's a shir out there. Arguably, the knee thing is very tzorichi and gadoldik. Many have written about it, and historically, that was not the point that people covered until. They covered much further, and in the Chassidish world till today, they're makbid to cover much further, and they're keeping more or less with a lived Messiah. And the knee is sort of based on a strange halachic claim that the shoik ends by the knee, and which is its own strange discussion. There are 50 rayas. The shoik goes much further. The last 50 years of sort of drawing a line and saying, okay, we're going to draw the line by the knee. But that's that formulating it that way, it appears to be a modern formulation. I would say perhaps more or less the same thing about the elbow, not quite the same thing, but I would think historically women probably covered much further, much past the elbow. Although maybe there was more tolerance about rolling their sleeves up when they were doing certain stuff. But I would assume the standard begadim went further. So the notion that like that's the code of dress for Jewish women is sort of a modern formulation. You could figure out how we got there, but there's something ahistorical about presenting it that way. And it's a subtle point that needs to be understood properly. But that's what I believe to be correct about that. There is a lot of art, representation of how Jewish people dressed throughout certainly the last 1,000 years and probably even earlier. And so it sort of really depends which area you're talking about. So, for example, Italy, which, as we know, had a Renaissance and was a bit more liberal generally. There is art, even from 500 years ago, that I think shows women's necklines being pretty low, almost to the extent that you could say that they were décolletés. And it seems like they were stam. That was what fromme women looked like in Italy. So Italy would be the exception here. In Western Europe, in the parts of Germany, parts that were Bohemia, etc., parts that were exposed to modern culture, early modern culture, it seems like you could also find Jewish women who are represented in art with plunging necklines. Certainly in England at the time, you can find that with the Sephardim or Ashkenazim. So the more Western one lived, and the more one was exposed directly to Western fashion, and one assumes that that's the beginning of when fashion started spreading among a larger number of people, or a larger number of people could consider themselves to be upper class than before, and therefore participating in that level of culture. So it seems like it became more common for women who, I don't know how they regarded themselves, what their own self-regard was for their level of religiosity. And there's an academic author, Feiner, who's written about the earliest stages of chilon, of Jews secularizing themselves, and it starts in the 1700s in certain Western parts. So you could find people dressed that way, but more or less in the parts of Europe that when we say we, I mean Haredim, the Chassidish world, the Yeshivish world, we sort of consider ourselves to be the default Jewish mode of living these days, rightfully or not. So these lands, it would seem, were very, very conservative in their dress until a very late point. It could be that the Gvir's wife, maybe she how many people we know people back then didn't have more than one dress. a poor person or even lower middle class, whatever that meant at the time, they may have only owned one or two dresses. It's not like they had that much to work with. They weren't fashion sort of requires keeping up to date and having a wardrobe. It's hard to engage in fashion if you don't have a wardrobe. So most people probably weren't shaykh. It could be the gvir if they had the ability to have a wardrobe. So then maybe the woman may have been dressing in certain up to date, even within covering everything up. There still were modes of fashion for those who were of higher standing. So there's definitely this art I've seen of supposed to be a Jewish woman in Poland, perhaps even in the 1700s. And she seems to be wearing shoes with heels, and her whole appearance just looks sharp. So I don't want to generalize and say that everyone just looked dowdy and didn't dress nicely. I don't think that's fair to say, and I don't want to exaggerate. So it probably depends who, but it would seem like most people, even today, the question is, should Jewish women who want to be, obviously many people have a different conception of what they think it means to be Jewish and to be from, but if you want to follow the Messiah, is the Messiah that women should look and feel beautiful, or is the Messiah that they should look very plain? In the Chassidish world, it's pretty clear that there is sort of a baseline that they should sort of look pretty plain, or there isn't much room for picking and choosing your own headgear, your own modes of dress. You're sort of restricted to a very narrow selection. And that does seem to reflect what dressing probably looked like for many Jewish women in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern European lands. And it's in that context that the sheitel was considered not part of the traditional mode of dress. It was considered a modern incursion that even the Chassam Sofer, who was from Germany, considered to be a pirza, and certainly the big Chassidish leaders in Poland a bit later also considered to be a pirza, because that was just simply not the traditional mode of dress. And as we know, at some point they started shaving their heads. Not fully clear; it's a bit of a mystery, but it was very widespread. So that was also part of it. And like I said, I don't know if looking and feeling beautiful was a value that was strongly held in these parts. Maybe people wore jewelry or felt good in other ways, but not necessarily in this sense. Not only that, it's not when we assume that rabbis are only intervening, mixing into women's dress in the last 100 years. That's also not strictly accurate. There's an entire corpus of literature, which is the pinkasim, the local pinkas of each community. Each community had a very strongly organized entity that ran it, the kahal, and it was literally like the local government equivalent to the city council, the mayor in its level of power over the members of the Jewish community. And they kept logs of their meetings, their minutes, their takanas, and it's an entire body of literature that most people are not exposed to and never get to see. So when we think about the past, what are we basing our imagination and our assumptions on? Not much. Open a Sefer, Shulchan Aruch, Reis Kelim, you're not going to get the picture of the takanas. Something might get mentioned in passing, but it's not the direct source for this information. You have to figure out in each case where the information appears. Sometimes it's in more academic publications. I'm not aware of any particular pinkus that was printed in full, Stama Zoya as a Sefer. But this is certainly very important. And if you don't have this information, then you're working with the record you're working with is missing a lot from the record. You have Sefer HaTakanas B'Yisrael from Rabbi Stepansky, but that focuses on more formal rabbinic takanas as opposed to communal takanas or takanas that are mentioned in Sfarim versus takanas that are not mentioned in Sfarim. So there's this whole world of takanas that are not mentioned in Sfarim. And but there are articles about them where you can find them. And it turns out that if you look in the takanas of communities, there are tons and tons of takanas that were very much seeking to control how women appeared. Often, in many, I would say 80, 90% of the cases, it actually related more to luxury and jewelry. And they were seeking to govern, to restrict. They were trying to clamp down. People shouldn't be wearing so much jewelry, whether not to create competition among Jewish people or not to make the neighbors jealous, the non-Jewish neighbors jealous. This was a big focus, and there was much takanas for simchas also. You can only invite a very limited number of people to simchas. This was always an ongoing struggle, which also ties into contemporary struggles. This has been an issue, goes back very far. But if you look, you'll find that a certain percentage do relate to takanas and tznius, and I have seen takanas and dafka in more Ashkenazi lands, not even in Eastern European, but in more Central Western European lands. There are takanas from the 1700s where it says women are not allowed to apply makeup. And the old word in Yiddish is schminken, which is still technically around. I don't know how many people use it in day-to-day discussion, but it says a woman. I haven't seen it in a while, but the way I remember it is they used to write the takanas in Yiddish often. So they write the Frau or the Isha, es wird sich wagen to schminken, will dare to apply makeup. So they'll announce to the whole area, to the whole region, her name will be announced and publicized that she is a chatzufa or a prutza. So there were some pretty interesting restrictions and some pretty interesting punishments and penalties that they were claiming to work with. Now, how did that play out in reality? I don't know. You would need even more research and insight to figure out how that actually played out in reality. And perhaps the makeup thing is dafka because they lived in Central Western Europe where the fashions at this point were starting to creep in. So previously, there was no thought of makeup. Now, this notion of makeup is creeping in, and these Western Central European communities who still, the leaders, the manhigim, still were holding b'toikif by their traditional mode of Yiddishkeit, so they were reacting to that and answering it. And I believe those who will look through that literature, and even in the Drashis literature from Yonis and Eibschitz, Yaakov Emden, there's certainly plenty of comments in their drashas and writings about the men's fashions at the time. The men were wearing powdered wigs and doing all that stuff. And again, this is like I said, it's in Western Europe. I don't think Eastern Europe was dealing with quite that problem at the time. But there was this issue of how the men were dressing, the women were dressing, and because that was bringing new fashions and non-Jewish fashions into the Jewish life, and the Kehillah, the Jewish community as a whole, still stood by their earlier, more traditional values. So they absolutely were reacting to these changes, to what they considered to be immodest, new modes of dress and behavior. And they were reacting to it. So before you draw historical conclusions, you first have to have access to the data in order to be familiar with it. Now, if you go further into Eastern Europe, it seems like these were not issues in the 1700s. Although if you look, and even in Chabad history, you see that there was a lot of sensitivity about not following the fashions. It doesn't seem like the fashions themselves were immodest per se, but there already was a notion of keeping up with some concept of fashion, even within the types of dresses that women could wear. Obviously, there could be a lot of range, a lot of variety of obviously many aspects. I'm not an expert on fashion, but those who look up the history of fashion of the time and see what changes were in style, so most women at the time were still dressing modestly, they were still covering up, but there's still a lot that could change within that range. And we find there are many, from the Alter Rebbe already on, we see that the Alter Rebbe was very sensitive to the men's fashion, to the women's fashion, and they try to be poil on their children, their grandchildren when they got married, not to have fancy clothing, to take the feather out of the hat, there's different stories about different such subtle things. I believe that Rabbi Hillel Paritcher was known in his region, I think maybe even less Chassidish sources, maybe the newspapers after he passed away, they wrote about how Rabbi Hillel in his region, he fought tooth and nail against the girls, the young women, wearing certain types of dresses. Maybe they were puffier or whatever the type of dress that was in style at the time. I think we could identify what it was, but I just don't remember it offhand. But Rabbi Hillel was actively pushing back against that. So there's always been a degree of sensitivity, and again, I don't think it had anything to do with tznius in the sense of covering up, but there are many other nuances and details, and just the idea of not keeping up with the fashions. Obviously, anything within that particular context can have a particular connotation. If you dress a certain way, doesn't necessarily, often in today's tznius discourse, often it comes down to, well, is the neck covered, is the elbow covered, is the knee covered? But the further you go along in the more Chassidish, more Haredi, more frum world, there are obviously many other details and nuances that dressing a certain way can be considered not tznius. The most obvious or interesting one is, some people have pointed out, there are some Sephardim, I think in particular, that are bothered by the fact that in the frum Haredi Chassidish world, it's considered not appropriate to wear ankle length dresses. Now, historically, Api Chazal, ankle-length dresses are great. What could be wrong with it? And yet the frum world insists that it's not okay. And if a girl comes to school in a Haredi school, Haredi community with an ankle-length dress, she'll be sent out, sent home. You have to change. So if you refuse to acknowledge that there are other factors, so that could just be taken as an example of how ludicrous, how silly, how irrational, how arbitrary. But I do believe that those, and often these conversations and these discussions, these debates are held in a very contentious manner, and there are people who are just unhappy about it. And that's also an interesting point that has to be addressed. Obviously, a lot of people in the frum world, from women, from girls, are coming out of school, coming out of their homes, and there's a lot of negative feelings, associations are surrounding the whole subject, and that's perhaps more of a newer phenomenon in how it's affecting people. And sometimes once people are independent, they go to the other extreme just so they can feel their independence, and then they have to settle down 5-10 years later to figure out what look they're comfortable with. So it's often hard to have a nice, pleasant discussion about it. By the way, I'll mention I don't think it's a one-sided thing. I think many men and boys, there are rules in yeshiva that govern how men and boys dress as well. A lot of nuances and subtleties, and the more years go on, the more rules are added. And some people react very negatively to that, and it traumatizes them, and people make fun of that. But I do believe that there is logic to these nuances. It's just often very funny to try to explain them and to justify them, especially to a hostile audience. So you end up being made to sound foolish by trying to explain them. But the reality is that subtleties and nuances make all the difference. Those who don't care about modesty and don't care about that one way or the other, they're still very attuned to the nuances of your dress and what they convey. And the reality is that every change and every nuance does convey something. There are those who are more attuned to fashion and more attuned to what they convey, and those who are less. So the frum world generally has a certain sensitivity, I believe, that is fundamentally normal within the frum Haredi historical context. There is a sort of sensibility as to what is considered modest and what is not. It doesn't come down to these technical. Often those who are being contentious about it will try to turn it into a technical issue. Well, is it covered? Is it not covered? But it's certainly more than that. And the more Chassidish you are, Chassidish are the most likely to just try to preserve the general mode of dress that could be traced back at least 100, 200 years, although there are some changes with that as well, which I want to get to. So I think this is the same phenomenon. This was happening already back with the Alter Rebbe and with the Bill Paracher. Before the covering, it wasn't about covering this part or that part. That still wasn't the issue. And yet, the feather in the hat had a certain connotation at the time, and the feather in the hat bothered whichever Rebbe it was, or this type of dress, this type of skirt bothered Bill Paracher because of the context at the time and the fashions, and what choosing to dress like that was signaling, was telegraphing to your surroundings. So the sensitivity has always been there. It's simply that within at least these communities, it does not seem there was ever a serious challenge to basic modes of modesty that had been in place for hundreds of years. And there were just certain, the overall outline of how a woman dresses, the headgear, the dress. Back then, interestingly, the minhag was the women wore something that covered their chest. It was called a brustuch. That was also considered part of the Amalig Jewish woman's lavush. I once delved into it a bit. I found there still are some actual articles of clothing that are preserved in some museums, or you can find it in different paintings or different pictures of women wearing the brustuch. It's mentioned in Jewish literature at the time. So that was like an extra level of tznius, which is interesting because sometimes that comes up in today's tznius discussions. Is covered up enough, or is there more to it than that? So in the Polish, Russian context, there was a Messiah to wear a brustuch, which also goes to show you how extreme this swing that we're talking about here was. So there were what exactly they wore, like I said, like the headgear, that was very specific. They had a sterntichel, there were different articles of clothing that were basics and well known at the time. So those had been in place for quite a long time. The men also already had, just like today, the Chassidish world is known for, the men are known for having their lavush. So there was a version of that lavush back then. Recently, I delved into the fact that apparently all very frum men in Poland and even in Russia apparently they did not wear shoes. They wore something that was closer to slippers in its appearance, but they wore it all the time. And when you see the word pantofel, which is mentioned in Chabad, mentioned in other places, pantofel is often translated as slippers, but slippers in the sense of house slippers. In Ivrit, all right, now they buy it, but they didn't wear it as slippers in the home. That was the shoe that they wore. And we find that the Ruzhiner, and this is before real fashion really transformed how Polish Yidden were dressing. Obviously, back then, someone who dressed modern was called a Deitschel. That was how the Polish referred to someone dressed modern, was a Deutsch, German. But even within the from Polish milieu, it was pantofel, slippers are the most chared, the most edel, and then goes shoes, and then goes shtivel, and the worst was galoshin. And we know in Chabad that when the sheikhet wore galoshin, they fired him from being a sheikhet. Like, what? Why would you fire? You have to live in that context. Understand? Apparently, the bigger the shoe, the bigger the boot. So it was the more goyish, the more vergrebt. You had to wear edel shich, even if it was dirty, even if it was a blotta, you still have to wear edel shich. And I saw one of the Vertlach books. They say b'shem Epes Tzaddik that Amol people wore pantofel. So you wore pantofel, you had to really avoid the blotta. Then they started wearing shich. Oh, so now you can walk into certain blottas. And then they switched to shtivel. And then they switched to kalash, and now they walk through the blotta, but he meant it also allegorically, metaphorically, that sort of corresponded to sinking more and more into the mud, into the blotta. So there were all kinds of details and subtleties that have been around for a very long time, and that really actually explains where the Chassidish world is coming from. It's not coming from nowhere, and often it's described as, it's orthodoxy, the invention of orthodoxy. Technically, the invention of orthodoxy was just giving a label to the status quo, which was keeping to all of these somewhat more extreme minhagim that many communities kept, and that label became known as orthodoxy. In Russia, there never was a tailung, there never was a reform. Some people just chose to be less religious, and some people try to remain at the same level of religiosity. They didn't have the word orthodox there, but the same phenomenon of trying to preserve tradition was there. And we find plenty of examples from before reform was invented of being makbid on the lavush, being makbid on these types of details. So it's also a bit of a misnomer to blame it on orthodoxy, ultra-orthodoxy. Orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy ultimately are about preserving modes of living, and Jews in Poland had dressed, the men and the women had been dressing a certain way for a very, very long time, going back to perhaps even the 1500s, the 1600s, for sure the 1700s, long before orthodoxy and reform. So there's a lot going on here. It's nothing's coming out of the blue, out of nowhere. So now comes the big crucial moment, particularly in Poland, is World War I. After World War I, something snapped and the Jewish religiosity cratered. You do have to keep in mind back then that today the Jewish world has sort of splintered into along the lines of religiosity. So if you're modern Orthodox and someone else is Chassidish, they almost have nothing to do with each other. There's no rabbi that's speaking to both. Back then, in Poland, still technically every city, every community had one rabbi, and that community could have a total range of those who are barely religious at all, Zionists, Stam Oilem Yidden, Chassidish, different factions of Chassidish who can't stand each other. Technically, each city mostly still had one Rav, and that Rav still carried a certain achrayus for all the Jews in their community. So you couldn't just withdraw to the people that are from like you. But as we're seeing, it wasn't just the case that the Oilemish Yidden or the Nachsidish Yidden were splintering off. Clearly, among the Chassidish as well, that's what we see from the Belzer Rebbe's announcement. Meaning, from the Agudas Rabbanim of Poland, you could say they're talking to the larger Jewish community that today would be considered just plain Orthodox or modern Orthodox, and would withdraw to their own community and their own institutions. But from the Belzer Rebbe, we see that it was even affecting Belz, and Belz was often described to be the most verknyacht Chassidus back then, and yet this is what he had to announce. So things must have been really not good, and that's, I think, also essentially that sort of coincides with a lot of modern phenomena. So the fact that Rabbanim are issuing korei to our newspaper hadn't been around for that much longer before. It depends on the land. Maybe in Russia they had it a bit earlier. But the idea that Polish rabbis would even be releasing a korei in some kind of coordinated way So if you go back to the 1700s, so there was a Vad Arba Haratzis, and they had the Yirid, and they would gather, and they would issue diktats. But that's the ancient, that's the old-fashioned mode of living. But the idea that there's a national committee of rabbis, and they coordinate, and they release statements and talk to the press and release or coordinate that everyone should darshan Shabbos Chazayin, that itself is already entering a more modern era, a more modern version of the Jewish rabbinate, the Jewish community. And this is coinciding with modern fashion. So somewhere around then is when fashion became accessible to almost everyone, or everyone considered themselves as striving to dress fashionably. So that's with the obviously modern capabilities of industry, the modern economy, modern news and media and information infrastructure that allows advertisements. The advertising industry was probably born somewhere around then, depending on which land you're in, but it was certainly coming to these lands only fairly recently. So, and the fashion is suddenly, after perhaps 1,000 years of Europe, where most people dressed fairly modestly, suddenly the fashion is approaching what we consider to be modern fashion. And so there's sleeveless dresses, and there are plunging necklines. And this is all sort of coinciding, and modernity is hitting the Jewish community, even the parts of Poland that had maybe held out on modernity. It's sort of crashing in along with the trauma and the displacement of World War I. So all of a sudden, so what I'm saying is that technically the striving to dress tzniustic or reacting to something that's not tzniustic or not edel or not in line with the previous tradition, previous values, that's not new, that's not an invention. But the particular pirza, the particular challenge, and the mode in which that response now comes across and is transmitted, that was apparently sort of invented around this time. So 100 years ago, the modern tznius korei was born. Of course, as we see from the context, we're talking about some really serious pirzas that, like I said, we don't hear korei about that per se anymore in the Frum community. Obviously, you still do have, at the edges of plain Frum, modern Orthodox, you certainly do have those who are perhaps dressing not even, it's not something that the standard Frum community would consider tolerable at all. But like I said, now we sort of splintered into, we're siloed, so we don't have to care about what other people are doing. But overall, when we think about rabbis and rabbanim in the Frum community, they're not reacting to that. However, what I believe is that what had to happen then was tznius had to be reinvented because it wasn't possible anymore to keep that exact mode of dress either for men or for women. They say in Bells up until around then, they were makbid not to wear pants, whatever the exact lavush was. They didn't wear modern pants. Chassidish men were makbid not to wear button-down shirts until around then. Even in Chabad, you have makredis that button-down shirt, that's fry, that's treif. It had to be tied at the neck. So there are many, many such, if you start paying attention, even like I said, in Chabad sources for pre-modern comments about dress, there's plenty of stuff, and there's plenty of sensitivities that people had to stuff like this. Obviously, wearing short versus long, that was the ultimate Deutsch versus Polish dress. The Deutsch, they wore shorter clothing. Whereas in Poland, obviously, wearing long lavush was the norm. Even in Chabad, until the Rebbe, more or less, standard Chassidim wore long lavushim. You see the Chassidim came out of Russia, came to America, the Chashav Chassidim, they all wore lang gareklach, and when the Rebbe wore short, that itself was more modern. So the point is that around this time, it almost became untenable for everyone to continue wearing literally the same albushim they've been wearing since the 1700s. And so it seems like even the most Haredi communities sort of had to reinvent what they consider to be the equivalent of the traditional lavush, but with updates for the society we live in today. So for example, maybe I spoke about this back when I spoke about the shoik be'isha. When the Satmar Rav came to America, it's described that when he came here, he had to sit down with stockings and figure out, and they brought him stockings, and he was putting it on his hand to see the different levels of thickness, and he chose the stockings that he thought were the requisite level of thickness, what they call jokingly bulletproof stockings, that he considered to be okay. So clearly, whatever, either the dresses went lower back in the Haim, or whatever the case is, they weren't wearing stockings, and now it's also to wear an ankle length dress. The dress has to end exactly whatever it is, mid calf, whatever the exact. I think even within the Chassidish world, there's dargis of how many inches below the knee. You can start getting technical, and then you start sounding a little ridiculous. But those who pay attention, those who are sensitive and aware, you'll notice that there are different standards. So the way I've always understood it, and I still think is the right framework here, is that a new modern version of the old traditional tznius had to sort of be invented. And again, it comes down to certain sensitivities that are hard to articulate, hard to explain, but they are there. Now what's happening is that obviously, like I said, the frum Haredi world is not dealing quite with stuff on the level of 1924, 1925 that we began with, but there are many things that clearly are encroaching and eating away at this new from look that's reinvented. For example, the sheitel, right? Up until a certain point, like I said, sheitlach were not considered acceptable. Then at some point in Chabad, the Rebbe said that women should only wear sheitlach. So that's what I see as this reinvention, this redefinition of tznius. That right now in Chabad, dafka tznius is dafka sheitel is tznius, and wearing other headgear is considered less tznius, which wouldn't have been the case back in Europe. And interestingly, you see that the Litvische Welt, which often tznius tracks very similarly to Chabad in many respects, they sort of landed on the same aesthetic, on the same sensibility, even though I don't think there was any coordination. Somehow the communities independently sort of landed on what a from modest edel b'shedin look would look like, using within the framework that modern fashion has now created for us. So we have to work within that world now. It doesn't make sense to go back to older levushim. That's where groups like Leif Tahar, obviously, I mean, from their perspective, we're all gone off track, or from our perspective, it's we can't go back. It's not appropriate to return to that mode of levush anymore. But you certainly have people that are bothered. They look at the Makairos and they're bothered by why the from sensibility today is not quite what stems with the Makairos that it did, and this and that the woman should wear. And the Chassidish world, to a greater extent, is a lot closer to trying to maintain a version of the headgear, etc., that the women wore back in the shtetl, but presumably even there usually are some updates. It's not identical. If there's a sheitel in the picture, then it's for sure not identical to what was done back in Der Heim. So that's sort of within the Chassidish world as well. There still are dargas, and maybe the Rebbitzins or certain extreme families are still keeping to a much closer version to what the headgear was back in the shtetl, etc. So that is the framework we use. So obviously, people that feel like they're being suffocated, and people are coming out of school, like I said, they're teenagers and they're entering their 20s and they have a very negative feeling about it. That is also partly unique to the world that we live in, because the more exposed you are to the world around you, and notions of beauty, of dress are there, whether you're seeing it directly or indirectly. So that's creating certain assumptions in your head. And by the way, the non-Jewish world, there's plenty of criticism about beauty standards and what that plants in your head, and plenty of completely irreligious people are also struggling with their appearance because there's some kind of standard that they are dreaming of meeting that they can't meet. So it's not a uniquely religious thing. It's just a religious twist on it, where that same pull that everyone's feeling, so if you're from, so then that pull becomes even more of a conflict because it's conflicting with your community's mode of dress, and you're likely to run into friction with school, with parents. So that's to the big extent, that's the fault of the rest, meaning there's the from world pulling in one direction and the rest of the world pulling in another direction. The rest of the world pulling you is certainly at least 50% of the problem and responsible for why people are unhappy. In other words, if you lived in the shtetl, it may have been you may have looked dowdy and you may have not had a very enjoyable life, and there were there was poverty and there was the plague, but you're less likely to have been psychologically scarred by the fact that you had to wear these traditional begadim. It's by living in a world that's so totally out of whack with our morals and our standards And being a part of that world to some extent, that causes this schism, this split, where you're pulled into opposing directions, and that's a lot more likely to create that type of tension and that type of trauma. So that's, I think, has to be. I think it's a fair point to keep in mind. But obviously, yeah, it's sort of tricky and challenging. I'm obviously to a great degree sympathetic to those that want to keep the tradition of tznius and not allow changes to encroach. Obviously, I want people to. I'm not going to come out and say I don't want people to feel good about themselves. To some extent, most normal men and women want to look good and want to feel good about themselves, even if that's not ultimately the ultimate Yiddish Chassidish value. But people are human. So it's I certainly don't want to take the achrayus to make people feel like they can't look how they can't feel good or can't look how they want to look. So it's tricky. It's we're sort of, again, whose fault is it? Is it being from that's at fault, or is it the rest of the world that's gone totally crazy that's at fault? Certainly there's room to turn and point the finger and blame the world. But the from world, I think ultimately, even though sometimes some of these kolkredas today, so instead of the more extreme stuff, they're focusing on what seemed like silly narish zachen. So sometimes it feels like certain rules have been put in place that weren't even around years ago. The dress code for kids in school seems to be getting more and more extreme over time. On the other hand, the dress code in the 60s and 70s, girls weren't even covering necessarily all the way to their knee. And that was, and you look in the 30s and 40s, and you have rebbitzins that weren't covering their elbows. So what's the aberration again? Maybe that point between World War I and the 80s was the aberration. And back then, if a person wore a dress and the dress was a little short and the sleeves were a little short, but within the larger context at the time, it still felt relatively modest. Whereas as the world around us keeps on getting more and more immodest, so it also sort of makes sense to sort of pull in the other direction. So again, who's to blame? Are we getting more extreme, or is the world around us getting more extreme? So we're sort of feeling that we have to pull the other way. So these are a lot of the points and considerations that are a factor here. I'm sure that was even though I spoke at length, it feels like it was a pretty condensed version of my thoughts on the matter. I imagine it's very easy to misunderstand, or a lot of it needs to perhaps requires more elaboration, but that's relatively bekitzer. Those are my thoughts on the matter. Interestingly, if you look at the Rebbe Rashab, one more source that I have, the Rebbe Rashab wrote a little bit about the plunge and tznius and the problem of pritzes, but he wrote about it much earlier. Talk in Russia, he was writing about it in 1901, 1902. So different lands, like I think I mentioned earlier, different lands had different trends, different processes at different times. So in Belz, in Belz at that time they were talking about Sheitlach. So I guess Sheitlach were encroaching then, but other stuff were still pretty much in place. Whereas after World War I, things really fell. But I think the truth is probably in Russia as well. After World War I, especially with communism, we know how some of the people dressed back then. It's a little hard to, sometimes today we're surprised at how people dressed back then. So yeah, like I said, each land though had its own story, its own trends, not necessarily identical to each other. But we don't find kolkredas either from Russia from this time. But coming close to kolkreda of the Rebbe Rashab, you have a bit in 1901, 1902, 1903, and it's mentioned among many other problems, many other pirtzis that were happening at the time. So it wasn't directly just calling out priestess. Also, like I said, the rabbinate in Poland was also being worried about Taras HaMishpacha. So people were dropping Taras HaMishpacha, even though they weren't officially declaring that they're going off the derech, and technically they were still part of the community, which would have been Orthodox. But so there was a lot was happening. It was the time people were in flux. Obviously, the world that we find ourselves in today, where the majority of Jews are not religious, in great part sort of dates to that time. A lot of the people who are not religious today, their grandparents around 1900 were still religious, but maybe they immigrated to America or whatever, or the World War I came along, World War II came along. So at that point, large chunks of the Jewish community were sort of in the midst of falling off, and the rabbis were trying to respond to all of that. Obviously, the guy in the newspaper in Yiddish was being sort of scornful and mocking their efforts, and perhaps he was technically right, because that trend was still very much in force. But at this point, post-World War II, where things have settled down and the communities have their identities, and those who do sort of drop their shtreimel or drop their beard, grew their beards back and put their shtreimels back on and returned to the tradition, the Messiah of how they dressed, how their families dressed, more or less, back in the shtetl. So that's where the community is, and that's where the communities come from, and that's what the communities are trying to preserve. So often these, even things that seem very minor, can still be understood as encroaching on the sensibility that a particular community wants to have. But obviously, like I said, you know what? There were Jews in Italy, there were Jews in other lands that had completely different versions of tznius. So personally, I'm not in favor of forcing people to adhere to stuff that's mamish making them miserable. Obviously, there still are certain lines that are considered pretty much universal, like I said, in terms of basic tznius. But otherwise, I said there's a lot more to tznius than those basic lines. But let's start with those basic lines and keep to those. But obviously, there is a range. It's a free country. People can gravitate towards a community that they feel is more in line with their current values. But at the same time, those who are trying to keep that Messiah to actually be from, be edel, be tznius in that traditional sense. So I certainly see justification for those that are oimid al hamishmar, that are trying to legislate and encode and dictate what those guidelines are. But it's tricky. Obviously, it's tricky. It's hard to find the right balance. Like I said, ideally, people, in my world, in my view, people should hopefully want to be from tznius and edel in a traditional way, but meratzin, not ba'enes. So obviously, I feel for those that are feeling pulled and feel like they're being harassed by the korei of the rabbanim. But that's the reality. And as people pointed out, the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, every year, summertime, would speak about tznius, both for men and for women. The Rebbe even on one occasion said that keeping tznius here helps the security of Eretz Yisrael, because when it comes to Muhammad, when it comes to the war, in Tanakh and Chumash, it says that the v'lira b'cha ervas dover. So the Rebbe expanded that to refer to the tznius of all Yidden. So this was a value that the Rebbe still held very dear, very important, and obviously it's a very well-trodden territory, material. Everyone knows the old Makaidas, lots of likutim, svarim, there are malak, and everything that I'm about to say about tznius. Not here to retread that, but that's like I said, the reality is that certainly the way that Rebbe ran Lubavitch, he wasn't micromanaging people's lives, but certainly in the sichos, he definitely called out certain behaviors and certain lack of tznius, and sometimes put people under the spotlight or made fun of certain behaviors and conducts. So you have to find the right balance of knowing the history, of knowing what the traditional levush and Messiah is, of trying to apply that or adapt that to the world, to the context that we live in today, and make an equivalent version that fits in within the fashions in the world we live in today. But people should want it and enjoy it, and not feel stifled and restricted. But obviously, it also is up to people individually not to allow themselves to be too influenced by the world of fashion, the world of beauty, which, like I said, by many people's opinion, is very toxic, very negative. Obviously, the world of fashion has gotten much more extreme just in terms of how much pressure there is to keep up with micro trends, and obviously it's just about making people part with their money and making people feel insecure. So all those criticisms are very valid. If someone's feeling insecure about how they're addressing tznius, is it tznius' fault, or is it about the insecurities that the world around us is planting in our heads? I think I've said enough, and we'll leave it at that.